It started like any other night. Quiet, ordinary. Nothing seemed out of place. But in the days before 6 people were murdered on a remote farm in Germany, the family began to notice that something was very wrong. There were footprints in the snow. They led to the farm, but never back out. A house key disappeared, and at night, someone seemed to be moving around in the attic. Then, after the family was dead, the farm did not go silent. The animals were still being fed. Smoke rose from the chimney. Food in the kitchen had been eaten. It was as if whoever had done this had never really left. Tonight's story begins on an isolated farm called Hinterkaifeck, where the warning signs came before the murders, and the truth may have died there too. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Echoes and Oddities. It's been a little while, but I'm really excited to return to this series because I've missed telling these kinds of stories. If you're new here, I'm Ivy Monroe, and whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on Spotify, I'm so glad you're here. Here, we talk about the strange, the odd, and the forgotten. From bizarre history to unsettling mysteries and true crime. These are the stories that linger, the ones that stay with you, the ones that still leave more questions than answers. And tonight's case is exactly that. We're heading to a lonely farm in 1920s Germany, where a family began noticing terrifying signs that something was wrong, just days before they were brutally killed. This is the story of Hinterkaifeck. But before we get into what happened that night, it helps to understand the isolated world these victims were living in. Because to understand why this case still feels so disturbing more than a century later, we need to start with the farm itself and the family who lived there. Hinterkaifeck was not a town in the way people sometimes imagine it. It was a small, isolated farmstead in Bavaria, tucked behind the hamlet of Kaifeck, surrounded by fields, woods, and long stretches of quiet. In 1922, it would have felt even more cut off from the rest of the world than it sounds now. There were no close neighbors just across the street, no busy road, no quick help if something went wrong. Just open land, cold air, and a farmhouse sitting in the distance, with its barn, stable, and attic, all connected in a way that made the place feel both self-contained and strangely enclosed at the same time. It was the kind of place where daily life was built around hard work. Animals had to be fed, wood had to be chopped, meals had to be made. And no matter what was happening inside the home, the work of the farm did not stop. The family living there was the Gruber family. Andreas Gruber and his wife Cecilia were the older couple who ran the farm. Living with them was their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, along with her 2 children, young Cecilia and little Joseph. And on the very day the murders are believed to have happened, a new maid named Maria Baumgartner had just arrived to begin work at the farm. 6 people, all living together in this isolated place. And from the outside, it may have looked like a simple farming household. But behind that picture was a family surrounded by tension, rumor, and quiet scandal. The Grubers were not especially well liked in the area. Neighbors talked, people gossiped about the family's strange dynamics, their conflicts, and the unsettling atmosphere around the farm. One of the darkest rumors centered on Andreas Gruber and his daughter Victoria. Years earlier, the two had been convicted of an incestuous relationship, something that brought shame to the family and only deepened the sense that something about life at Hinterkaifeck was deeply troubled. There were also whispers surrounding Joseph, Victoria's young son. Some believed his father was not who people assumed. Some believed the child may have been at the center of local disputes, family conflict, and resentment that ran deeper than anyone wanted to say out loud. Whether all of those rumors were true, half-true, or distorted by gossip, they mattered, because they shaped how people saw this family, and they shaped the theories that came later. But for all the gossip and suspicion surrounding them, the people living at Hinterkaifeck were still human beings living ordinary lives inside that farmhouse. An older couple trying to keep a farm running, a widowed daughter raising 2 children, a little girl, a small boy. a maid arriving for what should have been a normal first day of work. That's part of what makes this case feel so unsettling. Because whatever outsiders thought of this family, whatever secrets may have existed inside that house, they were still people moving through an ordinary routine in an ordinary week, with no real way of knowing how close they were to catastrophe. And in a place that isolated, when something started to feel wrong, there was no easy escape from it. No crowd to disappear into, no nearby safety, no noise from the outside world to drown it out. Just the farm, the family, and the growing sense that something was already there. In the days before the murders, Andreas Gruber began noticing things around the farm that did not make sense. At first, they may have seemed easy to dismiss. A strange detail, a missing item, a sound in the night. But taken together, they painted a picture that was far more disturbing. One of the first things Andreas reportedly found was a newspaper from Munich. That may not sound unusual at first, except no one at Hinterkaifeck was known to subscribe to a Munich paper. And in a place as isolated as this one, that kind of thing stood out. It suggested that someone had been there, someone who did not belong. Then there were the footprints. According to later accounts, Andreas found tracks in the snow, leading from the direction of the forest toward the farm. But what made the discovery so unsettling was that he did not see any tracks leading back away. Whoever had come to the property, at least from what he could see, had not left. Around the same time, a house key went missing. There were also reports that a lock or entrance to part of the property had been tampered with. And then there were the sounds. Andreas began hearing footsteps in the attic. Not once, not in passing, but enough to make an impression. Enough that he reportedly mentioned it to other people. Imagine living in a place already cut off from the world, and then hearing movement above your head at night, not knowing whether it was the house settling, an animal, or someone quietly moving in the dark. At some point, the family's unease had grown enough that Andreas spoke to neighbors about at least some of what had been happening. But despite the strange footprints, despite the missing key, despite the noises in the attic, he did not leave the farm. He did not bring in police in any meaningful way. And when help was offered, he is said to have turned it down. That decision has haunted this case ever since. Because looking back now, it feels impossible not to wonder whether the danger had already arrived. Whether whoever was responsible for what happened at Hinterkaifeck was already watching the family, already learning their routine, or perhaps already hiding somewhere on the property itself. And that possibility becomes even harder to shake when you remember what came later. Because after the murders, there were signs that someone had not only been there, but may have remained there. So when people look back at those final days before the killings, these details do not feel random. They feel like warnings. Small, eerie warnings that something was closing in on that farm long before anyone knew how this story would end. By the end of March 1922, whatever uneasy feeling had settled over Hinterkaifeck had not gone away. If anything, it seems to have been getting worse. And then came March 31st. That day, a new maid named Maria Baumgartner arrived at the farm. It was her first day there. Her sister is believed to have walked with her to the property, meaning Maria may have entered Hinterkaifeck for the very first time only hours before she was killed. That detail alone is heartbreaking. She was not part of the family's history, not part of their tensions, not part of the rumors surrounding that house. She had simply arrived to begin a new job and walked into one of the most haunting, unsolved crimes in modern history. What happened next can only be reconstructed in part. No one survived to explain it. But investigators came to believe that sometime during the evening, 4 members of the household were killed in or near the barn area. Those victims were Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, their widowed daughter Victoria, and Victoria's young daughter, also named Cecilia. Exactly how they were drawn there, or in what precise order they died, has never been known with complete certainty. Some later retellings suggest they may have been lured there one by one. Others believe the sequence may have been different. But what is clear is that the first part of the attack appears to have happened away from the main living quarters, in the barn or just beside it. At some point after that, the killer moved into the house. Inside, Maria Baumgartner was killed in her room, and little Josef, just a small child, was also murdered. 6 people, all gone in a single night. And the weapon investigators later identified was not some elaborate outside instrument brought in for the crime. It was a farm tool, a mattock, something already on the property. That fact has always made the case feel even more intimate and disturbing, because it suggests the killer may have known the layout of the farm, known what was available there, and known how to move through that property in darkness. And perhaps the most unsettling part is this: there does not appear to have been a frantic escape. No obvious sign that the killer struck and immediately fled into the night. Instead, what followed would make the entire crime feel even stranger. Because in the days after these 6 people were killed, the farm still showed signs of life. Which means that by the time this family lay dead inside their own home, the horror of Hinterkaifeck may not have been over. If the story of Hinterkaifeck ended with the murders alone, it would still be remembered as a horrifying crime. But what happened after the killings is one of the main reasons this case has never really left people alone. Because after the family was dead, the farm did not immediately look abandoned. And what makes this case especially disturbing to me is how the warning signs came first. This family seemed to realize something was wrong, and still had no idea how close they were to disaster. In the days leading up to the murders, Andreas Gruber had reportedly mentioned some of the strange things happening around the farm to other people. The footprints, the missing key, the sounds in the attic. So at least some of that unease had already been spoken out loud. And yet, whatever was closing in on that family was already much closer than anyone seemed to understand. In the days that followed, there were signs that someone was still there. The animals had been fed. That detail matters more than it might seem. On a working farm, feeding livestock was not a small task someone could do absent-mindedly. It was part of a daily routine, a necessary chore, something that required effort, familiarity, and presence. And yet somehow, after 6 people had been murdered, that work was still being done. Smoke was also seen rising from the chimney, which meant someone had likely kept a fire going inside the house. And inside the kitchen, there were signs that food had been eaten. Bread had reportedly been cut. Meat from the pantry had been used. The house did not look like a place where violence had happened and then instantly gone cold. It looked, in some strange and deeply unsettling way, lived in. That detail has haunted this case for more than a century, because it suggests something almost impossible to accept: that whoever committed these murders may not have run. They may not have rushed off into the darkness. Instead, they may have stayed on the same property, among the same buildings, moving through the same rooms where the dead still lay undiscovered. And I think part of what makes this case hit so hard is that, for all the rumors and scandals surrounding this family, so much of who they actually were has been lost to time. We know their names. We know the basic shape of the household. We know some of the gossip, some of the tensions, and the terrible way their lives ended. But we do not really know their personalities. We do not know their private hopes, their small routines, or the ordinary things they may have been looking forward to. And that feels especially sad in a case like this, because it means the mystery survived, but so much of their humanity did not. Still, even with those gaps, the reality remains haunting. An older couple running a farm, a widowed daughter, 2 children, a maid on her first day of work, all of them gone. And yet the farm still appeared active, as if life had continued there, even after life had ended. And all of it raised one terrible question. If someone was still moving around that farm after the murders, how close were they to being discovered? By early April, people around Hinterkaifeck were beginning to notice that something was wrong. The family had missed church. Young Cecilia had not shown up for school. And for a household living by such a fixed routine, those absences stood out. At first, maybe it did not seem like enough to spark immediate panic. But little by little, the silence around that farm started to feel unusual. Then, on April 4th, a man named Albert Hoffner arrived at Hinterkaifeck to repair the farm's feed chopping machine. And this part is hard to wrap your head around. He came to the property, worked there for hours, and still did not immediately realize that everyone inside was already dead. He reportedly saw no one from the family. No one came out to greet him. No one answered. And yet, the farm itself did not appear completely abandoned, which again is just chilling. Because if the signs are true, if someone really had remained there after the murders, then it is possible Hoffner was not as alone on that property as he thought he was. Later that same day, concern had grown enough that several local men went to the farm to check on the family. Among them was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who had known the household well, along with neighbors Michael Pohl and Jakob Siegel. When they arrived, they began looking around the property, and before long, they made a horrifying discovery. Inside the barn, they found 4 bodies: Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, their daughter Victoria, and Victoria's young daughter, little Cecilia. The victims had been covered with hay, as if someone had tried to conceal them, or perhaps simply did not want to look at what had been done. And while I do not want to be unnecessarily graphic, the scene made one thing painfully clear. These murders had been brutal. The victims had suffered violent blows, and the people who found them would have understood immediately that this was not a quiet death, but a deeply shocking and savage crime. After that, the men entered the house. There, they found Maria Baumgartner in her room, and little Josef inside the home as well. 6 people, an entire household, gone. And I think one of the most heartbreaking details in all of this is how ordinary the warning signs looked from the outside. A missed church service, a child absent from school, no answer at the door. Small things, the kind of things that, in real life, do not always signal the worst right away. But here, they did. By the time anyone forced their way into the truth of what had happened at Hinterkaifeck, the family had already been dead for days. And with that discovery, the isolated farm that had already felt strange and troubled became something else entirely. A crime scene. A village nightmare. And soon, one of the most infamous unsolved murder cases in German history. But even then, for all the horror of what had been found, the mystery was only just beginning. Once the bodies were found, Hinterkaifeck stopped being just an isolated farm with a dark reputation. It became a crime scene, and almost immediately, that crime scene was compromised. Investigators from Munich were brought in, led by Inspector Georg Reingruber. But by the time the authorities began their work, too many people had already moved through the property. Onlookers had walked around the scene, disturbed potential evidence, and even used the kitchen. In a case this brutal and strange, those first hours mattered, and some of what might have helped solve it may have been lost right there. On April 5th, court physician Johann Baptist Allmüller performed the autopsies inside the barn. And honestly, that detail alone says a lot about how different this investigation was from what people expect now. This was not a sealed modern forensic scene. This was 1922. And while investigators were able to determine that the victims had died from violent blows to the head, the case was already becoming harder to untangle. It was during those early examinations that investigators concluded the most likely murder weapon was a mattock, a heavy farm tool, even though the weapon itself was not found right away. There was also evidence that at least one victim, young Cecilia, may have survived for some time after the initial attack. And that is one of the details in this case that really gets me. Not because I want to linger on suffering, but because it reminds you that this was not some distant legend. These were real people, real fear, real pain, a real family. And for all the mystery surrounding Hinterkaifeck, moments like that bring the story back down to something painfully human. Investigators removed the victims' skulls and sent them to Munich for further examination. But even that would not lead to closure. Those skulls were later lost during World War II, which means some of the most important physical evidence in the case disappeared forever. That loss is part of what makes this investigation feel so frustrating even now. At first, police considered robbery as a possible motive. That made some sense on the surface. A remote farm, a violent attack, an entire household killed. But the deeper investigators looked, the less cleanly that theory fit. Money and valuables were still found on the property. And when you combine that with the signs that someone may have remained on the farm after the murders, feeding the animals, using the house, keeping the fire going, the crime starts to feel less like a simple theft gone wrong and more like something personal, or at the very least, deeply unusual. Police questioned traveling craftsmen, vagrants, and people from nearby villages. They followed rumors. They looked at local grudges. They tried to make sense of a household already surrounded by gossip and scandal. But from the very beginning, this case had a problem that would never really go away. There were too many theories and not enough clean evidence. And that, to me, is one of the most haunting parts of Hinterkaifeck. Because this was not a case with no clues. It was a case with too many broken clues. Too many details blurred by time, rumor, disturbed evidence, and missed opportunities. Even decades later, when modern reviewers look back at the investigation, they criticize the lack of professional forensic work, including the failure to take fingerprints, something that was already known and used at the time. In other words, this case was not impossible to investigate, but it may have been mishandled in ways that made the truth harder to reach. And then, as if this case were not eerie enough already, one of the most important pieces of evidence appeared only later. The mattock believed to have been used in the killings was eventually found hidden in the loft of the barn, after the murders, not during the first immediate search. Which raises another disturbing question. How thoroughly had that property really been searched in those early days? And what else might have been missed? As the investigation continued, police were left with a case full of eerie details, but no clear answer. There was no confession, no clean forensic trail, no single theory that explained everything. And that is where Hinterkaifeck becomes especially frustrating. Because this is not a case with no suspects. It is a case with suspects, rumors, and possibilities, but nothing that ever fully locked into place. The name that comes up more than any other is Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He had known the family well. He had been involved with Victoria Gabriel after the death of his first wife, and he was widely discussed as a possible father of Josef. He also lived very close to the farm, close enough that if he had wanted to watch the property or move between his own home and Hinterkaifeck unnoticed, he likely could have done so. And what made people look at him even more closely was his behavior on the day the bodies were discovered. When Schlittenbauer arrived at the farm with Michael Pohl and Jakob Siegel, the men had to force their way into the barn area. But after the bodies were found there, Schlittenbauer reportedly went into the house alone and managed to unlock the front door from the inside. That stood out because a key had reportedly gone missing from the household shortly before the murders. Schlittenbauer later said the key had simply been left in the door. Now, to be fair, suspicious behavior is not the same thing as proof. And that is important. A person can act strangely in a moment of panic, shock, or grief. Still, in this case, the details kept piling up. Over the years, there were claims that Schlittenbauer made odd remarks about the murders, comments some people interpreted as if he knew more than he should have. There was also a later report that he was found at the demolished site in 1925 and spoke as though he understood details about what the killer may have tried to do with the bodies, even though that had not been publicly established in that way. And honestly, I can understand why his name has followed this case for so long. But I also think this is where older unsolved crimes become difficult, because suspicion can harden into legend, and legend is not the same as evidence. Schlittenbauer was never convicted, and before his death in 1941, he reportedly won several civil cases against people who publicly called him the murderer. So while he remains one of the most discussed suspects, he cannot honestly be presented as the solved answer. Another early theory was robbery. On the surface, that must have seemed possible. A remote farm, a violent attack, an entire household wiped out. But the robbery theory weakens pretty quickly. A significant amount of money was reportedly still found at the house, and valuables had not simply vanished. When you add that to the signs that someone may have stayed on the property afterward, feeding the animals, eating food, keeping the place active, it starts to feel much less like a straightforward theft and much more like something personal, or at the very least, highly unusual. There were also theories that the killer may have been someone else from the family's orbit. A former worker, a local man with a grudge, someone familiar with the farm and comfortable moving through it. That idea has always had weight because the crime does not feel random. The use of a farm tool already on the property, the apparent ease of movement around the buildings, and the possibility that the killer remained there afterward all suggest someone who may have known the setting well. That does not identify one person, but it does make the crime feel intimate rather than distant. And then, of course, there are the more dramatic theories. One of the most famous claims was that Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, who was believed to have died in the First World War, had somehow survived and returned. It is a striking theory, but it is also one that rests more on mystery and imagination than strong evidence. Contemporary accounts and later summaries state that men from his military unit had identified his body, even though rumors that he might still be alive persisted afterward. Modern writers have also floated far broader theories, including the idea that an itinerant serial killer could have been responsible. One of the more widely discussed examples is the Paul Muller theory, proposed much later by Bill James. But that theory is highly speculative and has not been accepted as the definitive answer to the case. So where does that leave us? With a suspect who still draws the most attention, a handful of theories that explain parts of the crime, but not all of it, and a case where the strongest clue may simply be this. Whoever killed the family at Hinterkaifeck may have known them, may have known that farm, and may have felt comfortable enough there to remain among the dead for days. And to me, that possibility is more unsettling than almost anything else in this story, because it suggests proximity. Not some faceless stranger passing through, but someone close enough to the rhythms of that place to move through it in darkness and stay after the violence was over. Even now, more than a century later, no theory answers every question. And that is why Hinterkaifeck still lingers. Not because there are no possibilities, but because none of them can fully close the door. More than a century has passed since the murders at Hinterkaifeck, and yet this case still lingers. Not just because it was violent, not just because it was never solved, but because so many parts of it feel unfinished. The warning signs before the murders, the possibility that someone stayed on the farm afterward, the strange, broken trail of evidence, the suspects who were discussed for years, but never definitively tied to the crime. Hinterkaifeck is one of those cases that seems to resist closure. And I think part of the reason it still gets under people's skin is because it does not feel like a mystery that disappeared into the past. It feels immediate. It feels close. A family in an isolated home. a growing sense that something is wrong, a terrible act of violence, and then silence. The kind of silence that lets rumor, fear, and imagination grow around it for decades. Over the years, investigators, writers, and modern researchers have all looked back at this case trying to answer the same basic question. Who did this? And maybe just as importantly, could it ever really have been solved? Because when you look at how the crime scene was handled, how evidence was disturbed, how crucial items were lost over time, it becomes painfully clear that some of the best chances to solve this case may have vanished almost as soon as the bodies were found. That is one of the most frustrating things about Hinterkaifeck. Not that there were no clues, but that the clues were damaged, blurred, or left behind in a way that made the truth harder to reach. And then there is the human side of it, the part that can get lost beneath all the theories. Because for all the attention this case has received, the people at the center of it still feel strangely out of reach. We know their names, we know the basic outline of their lives, we know the gossip that surrounded them, the farm they lived on, and the terrible way they died. But so much else is gone. Their voices, their personalities, their private hopes, the ordinary things they may have laughed about, worried about, or looked forward to. And I think that absence is part of what makes this story so sad. The mystery survived, but so much of their humanity was swallowed up by the crime itself. Even in more recent years, modern reviews of the case have not been able to offer a neat ending. People may have strong opinions about who the killer was. Some theories seem more convincing than others. But no answer closes every gap. No theory settles every detail. And so Hinterkaifeck remains what it has been for generations now, an open wound in the history of true crime. A case people return to, not because it is sensational, but because it feels unresolved in a deeper way. It leaves behind the kind of questions that do not fade easily. What did the family truly understand in those final days? Who was moving around that farm? Who fed the animals after the murders? And was the killer someone close enough to that household to move through it without fear? Those questions are still here, still hanging over that farm, still waiting for an answer that may never come. And maybe that is why Hinterkaifeck continues to haunt people. Because it is not just a story about murder. It is a story about dread, about isolation, about warning signs that came too early to understand and help that came far too late. In the end, Hinterkaifeck remains one of those rare cases that feels disturbing in every direction you look. There is the violence of the crime itself, the isolation of the farm, the warning signs that came before it, the awful possibility that the killer stayed behind after it was over. And then, beneath all of that, the people at the center of it, a family living out what must have felt like an ordinary stretch of life. An older couple trying to keep a farm going, a widowed daughter, 2 children, a maid arriving for her first day of work. None of them could have known that the quiet around them was about to turn into something so brutal and so permanent. And maybe that is what makes this case so haunting, even now. Not just that it was never solved, but that it seemed to announce itself first, in footprints, in missing keys, in strange sounds overhead, as if the farm itself was trying to warn them, and no one could yet understand what those warnings meant. More than 100 years later, the name Hinterkaifeck still carries that feeling. Not closure, not certainty, just dread, loss, and questions that never fully settled. Who was there in the days before the murders? Who moved through that house after the killings were over? And who carried this secret into the grave? We may never know, but the silence left behind at Hinterkaifeck has never really ended. It has only echoed forward, from that lonely farm in Bavaria into history. And maybe that is why people still talk about it. Because some stories do not just end. They linger, they wait, and they leave behind a feeling that something terrible happened there. and that the truth, somehow, is still just out of reach. Until next time, I'm Ivy Monroe, and this is the Echoes and Oddities podcast.